Hello and welcome to Barbados' Sea Portal. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm glad that you have joined us. In our last program, we discussed the erection of the ancillary buildings on the reclaimed land and how they were utilized by the port. In this week's program, we will, in a sense, put the port in its historic, economic, and social context. In so doing, it is hoped that you will get a better understanding of the ripple effects that its construction and subsequent opening had on Barbados. The new port is now officially opened. Over 90 acres of land is suddenly made available to Barbados. There's relatively a lot of land waiting to be used. The question is, what do you do with this available land?
KFL campus, really, what is now the KFL campus, was actually started very quickly after the harbour was opened.
The university has come on stream. The university was first at the Bridgetown Harbour. Let's not forget that. At the northern end of the Bridgetown Harbour, there was the first beginning of the University of the West Indies, which ultimately transferred to KFL in 1967.
And the youngsters and so on who were eligible, I was working at the time at St. Leonard's and I was thinking about going, but some of my mates had already signed up and so on, especially the ones from around town. They seem to know a bit more than some of us, you know.
The university campus for Barbados came into being in 1963. And for the first 4 years, the campus was down at the harbour.
And this was just before the community colleges opened and so on, and then the KFL campus. By the time the campus was open, I was off in England.
Before the campus was open, a Caribbean trade fair was held on the site. And in fact, the same buildings that were used for the trade fair were the same buildings that formed the campus.
I think it must be mentioned that the trade fair was of great significance. I would say virtually stupendous proportions, because given the historic agricultural background of Barbados and the lack of industries and so on, to have the site being used as an industrial exhibition was really a great thing, because the only thing I had known about an industrial exhibition prior to that was in the history books of the 1851 exhibition in London, which was a major thing during the Industrial Revolution and cemented Britain as the workshop of the world. And that exhibition would have done a lot to expose Barbados, number one, and to give ideas for entrepreneurs and so on, the early entrepreneurs and so on, to see what was possible. And I believe Gary Husbands and other people and so on came after. But before that, you had the blacksmiths and people of that nature. People were still doing barrels, coopers, and so on. And the industrial base was very flat.
Interestingly enough, it's interesting that you mentioned the coopers and so on, because they made the barrels to ship the molasses. You see, they made barrels to ship the molasses, and naturally with the death of that type of shipping, those people don't. I think there are very few left in the island today. I think.
Yeah, it's very important for the lightermen too, because they were part of that. Because into that, with the land space enhanced, what happened thereafter was actually a number of things. But thereafter, you had the land being used for the pioneer industries, and the port now became a center of industrial activity in Barbados.
The BIDC building is there, and around it, you've had a number of industrial units. The industrial unit harbour area became a major area, like Grisette's and Newton, for establishing industries. Some people say toothbrush industries. They say dismissively and derisively that we just put in small parts for overseas consumer items. But nonetheless, it employed people, and in the matter of data processing, that's one of the first areas in which young people, mainly women, data entry, they got jobs down there, and they still can get jobs down there at the Harbour Industrial Park doing data entry. Colgate was down there, Bico Barbados ice cream making company established itself down there.
The industrial factories were humming in those days. You saw a number of people with small, local Barbadians with small industries. Other people from foreign countries came in and set up industries as well. There were companies that came in. Well, sometimes a little bit short-sighted, but it did help in those days. They came in and they set up factories because they had tax holidays, and substantial number of females, women, worked in those factories. And again, it was a situation where sometimes they worked 24 hours. And the bus system accommodated them too. The buses would run to the factories late at night and so on and so on.
So the harbor area has now taken on a new profile. All the accoutrements, all the support buildings, and the ancillary services of an industrial area have been established. No longer is water. It is unrecognizable now from what it was, 53 years ago. Who would imagine?
Truth be told, perhaps apart from the engineers, the visionaries at that time were men like then Prime Minister of the West Indies Federation, Sir Grantley Adams, Premier Hugh Gordon Cummins, and Ronald Mapp. It is now no wonder that the former has been accorded the title of National Hero of Barbados. The tourism industry in Barbados took on newer dimension after the opening of the Deepwater Harbour. Senator Adams recounts his experiences of witnessing this forward drive in that industry.
And around that time or a little before, you had places like Colony Club and Miramar also being developed, so that the hotel industry as an industry began to come into play, because my mother was what they call in those days a servant, and she lived, and some of my aunts as well, she would work at these homes, and often, in fact, my grandmother brought me up because she would actually live in and come home occasionally, largely to save money as well. And now, with the coming of these hotels, Sandy Lane and the others that we just mentioned on the West Coast, it began to transform the employment situation in the island, because our folk, men and women folk in particular, were trapped on the plantation. And I say trapped because I think deep down they always wanted to get off, but they couldn't for a number of reasons, historic reasons and so on, and economic reasons. When these hotels started to open up, Sandy Lane and the others, they moved away from the cane fields in droves. And also youngsters, some of them who might not have been qualified to go into the civil service, even if they went to the secondary schools that existed at the time, and others who would have been from the all-age schools, as we call them, elementary schools. They began to work in pretty significant numbers in the industry, and you would see them dressed in, these four-seam black pants and white shirts and so on. And so Barbados began to change in that sense. And the harbour, we are saying all of this to say that if you see the harbour in its historic and economic and social context, that you get a clear picture of what actually happened there.
The port was conceptualized to place the island in a position where it could handle its imports and exports more efficiently, and so to generate wealth for the island. There was the consensus among our people that the port in itself was all about wealth, and being a port worker was the dream and aspirations of many Barbadians. For them, the employment prospects afforded by this new facility here on the Pelican Island represented an opportunity for them to improve their lots in life.
But it appeared to many of us in the island that working at the port, even in the building of the port, was a pretty lucrative affair. They seemed to get a salary or a wage above the average. And there were some people, one or two that had left school with us, and others who were just ordinary guys in the thing, were working there. And very quickly they would have Vespas. A Vespa was a motorcycle and so on. And at that time I was working for $88 a month. I would go home and give it to my mother. she would give me back, I don't know, $10 or $20, and I would borrow it back. Before the week was out, I would borrow the money back from her and so on. And but these guys seem to have, you know, a bit more money, and so we're able to do a number of things that would enhance the standard of living and so on.
Let us take a look at the physical development of the island, and notably the road network. As you were told in a previous program, the coastal road ended at Land's End. With the opening of the Bridgetown Harbour came newer road networks in Barbados. In fact, just about 20 years after the opening of the port of Bridgetown, then Prime Minister Tom Adams broke sod to start the construction of the Spring Garden Highway.
But in later years, the concept of the seaport to airport highway again has revolutionized the whole concept of industries and so on in Barbados. We see the same warning that is there perhaps would never have been if the highway was not there and all the other things that go with it. And now you have the tourists come in by plane, and within 20 minutes or so they're at the harbour and so on, and get on a tourist boat and so on, and vice versa. So the importance, the social, economic aspect, and even psychological aspect of the building of the harbour was an event that not only was it controversial at the time, and some people felt that it should not have been built and so on, but as time progressed, the planners of the day has proven that it was a good thing to happen and to bring the island into the modern age and to diversify the economy. You can scarcely think of any other single project that would have been so important in the diversification of the Barbadian economy in all sorts of ways. So I think that although at the time it was caused some political upheaval far beyond the building of the same highway that I just spoke about. It was a massive anti-building of the harbour movement in the island. But to have stuck to the task for the good of the country, I think was a good thing. And obviously the Barbados Workers Union have come to realize that the harbour has become more important to them than the lightermen had been, or you know, in those days, and it's come to be the main, almost virtually the mainstay of the union, even though at the time they did not see it in that light. They were really fighting for their workers. To lose the lightermen, they go out and so on. They at the time could not see the replacement, but that was a little bit short-sighted, I thought. But later on, then the new airport and so on complemented the harbour.
Seawell Airport, like the new port of Bridgetown, may be regarded as a symbol of the great strides Barbados is making. Regular visitors and even Barbadians who leave their homeland for short periods are amazed on their return to note the changes that have taken place.
Our first major international port, Seawell, given the name of Grantley Adams International Airport. Not to be outdone, the port, the harbour, not being given the name of any politician, which perhaps is beautiful, but likewise, that developed solidly as our nautical naval port. And thus Barbados entered independence in 1966 with two major ports. An airport, which by international standards was adequate. It accommodated medium range, intercontinental passenger airliners, and a seaport, which was growing. Then 1966, it had been in operation only 5 years, and it has grown by leaps and bounds since then, our second port.
And Barbados has never been the same again. And the standard of living has increased by leaps and bounds. way of life and things of that nature, which when we started out, we spoke about Barbados of the 50s, that we were not, you know, the center of the earth at that time as we think we are now and so on. The type of work that were done by the people in general and the leaders of the country at the time, the 50s and the 60s and so on, has really done a lot to lay the groundwork for the development.
Now, you do not have to stretch your imagination to see the development in social services that came about after the construction of this new harbor.
The hospital at the time, because at the same time you were looking to get the industrial base, Barbados up to the 1950s was an extremely poor place. People don't like to say that. We always say that we were best in the Caribbean and so on for whatever reason. And I think young people ought to know, and they will better appreciate what is being there now, because the development since the 1960s and now is really stupendous. It is unbelievable. Barbados, for example, we had a hospital. It was aged. It was probably built in the 18th or the 19th century and so on. And the foresight to build that hospital virtually at the same time you were going to the harbor had a lot to do with the development of the island because of health and development. And it was a 600-bed hospital, and it's serving the island pretty adequately, you know, now that the population has almost doubled. But it was a time, though, when the island had about the highest infant mortality in the Caribbean and in the world. That means that children who were being born died very early, and many of the mothers, I don't want to make it sound like a calamity, but a lot of mothers died in childbirth and so on. And the midwifery was elementary. The midwife was, you had to go and catch the midwife on a bicycle and get her to the house and send the boys up to the house and put on the pot, the iron pot and so on, and boil water. And the baby would be delivered at the house. So the idea and the concept of prenatal care and having the baby born in real congenial conditions and postnatal care and so on really came about at that time and was developed further on.
Work on a new $6 million, 500-bed hospital at Stockton began in September 1959. When completed, the new hospital will be amongst the most modern and best equipped in the West Indies.
And that for the planners, they have to have some kudos for that.
Government is tireless in its efforts to improve the health standards of the community. With the establishment of health centres at Speightstown, Enmore, Oistins, and the Six Cross Roads, there's been a marked improvement in the health of the people and an appreciable decline in the incidence of tuberculosis, syphilis, and enteric fever.
With the harbour came economic development and high standards of living and expectations. And it is perhaps the bedrock of the new Barbados in a way, and later on the airport, obviously. So the communication and the health services and so on were very key sectors in actually setting the foundation for the building of the island. So I thought I would mention that there were some projects at that time that you might almost want to say were beyond their time, and that we did have some forward planners at that time, and of course that was built on later on.
The housing stock in Barbados was also transformed, and like the social services, the road and network and other amenities, there is a correlation between the opening of the harbour and the improvement in living conditions of Barbadians.
The 50s and the 60s and so on has really done a lot to lay the groundwork for the development. I left the island in 1965 and I came back in 1980, and even then I was really amazed just to see the improvement in the housing stock and things of that nature. This was an island of chattel houses for all kinds of reasons. A lot of people did not own land, And when you didn't own land, you could not build a wall structure on it. And so when I came back, I found that there was so much building and so on going on and so on. And the economy was a different economy from the fledgling one that I had left.
And so Barbados continued its journey on the pathway to progress and economic development, all propelled by the opening of the Deepwater Harbour. Now, that was the overall effect throughout the island. Back here at the port, facilities were opened up for a number of activities for pleasure seekers.
And north of it, we've had, what do you call it, the area for smaller vessels, the shallow draft area. And I think you have a picture there, yes, of the shallow draft. Yes, there it is. Shallow draft area was created and constructed decades after your port was established. Your catamarans and your submarine, the Atlantis, the Stavronakita, and other sightseeing vessels which were sunk there for people to form permanent museums for children and other people to look at. All those were done around your port there. And we remember that the port became so exciting for people, two sets of people, really those persons who wanted to go on the Harbour Master and the Jolly Roger.
We then planned that, okay, but let's do a little lunch cruise. We had some fellows involved in some mini mocks and whatnot. We started at $10. $10 US was for a trip, including transport to the ship. All you could eat, there was steaks in those days, and rum punch, whiskey, beer and whatnot, and your trip back home. But when we started out, when we had 40 or 50 people, we thought we had a lot. And it grew and grew and grew and grew, because the people were getting the value for the money.
And the Bajan Queen, which were pleasure boats, which now brought people into the environs of the harbour in order to give them jollification and rides up the west coast, right? The harbour master having the dominant position until 2 years ago when it went off to Trinidad. And secondly, and more recently, we've had Tim's on the highway, modern institutions of revelry established with regard to crop over. And crop over activities now end on the Spring Garden Highway, which did not exist when the port was open, coming into being in the 1980s. 1980s, one remembers Ras Riley's Spring Garden A-Coming, which heralded to the world that we now had a Bajan highway, what the Trinidadians call a long road, but nonetheless for us our first highway, a Spring Garden Highway. All of that has developed from and out of the Bridgetown port, the Bridgetown Harbour. The Bridgetown port now has its own character, its own history indeed. So many studies have been done on the Bridgetown port from a perspective of trade union, from perspective of economic activity, government supported.
The story of Barbados's economic expansion post the opening of the Deepwater Harbour ranks high on the island's list of important stories about its overall development. Sometimes it is somewhat sad to think that there was so much opposition to its construction back in the 1950s and early 1960s, but that comes with any new project.
Now, people in 1961 railed against the coming of the Bridgetown port, as people have railed for centuries against new technologies. Their objection and complaint against the Bridgetown port were based on heritage, that is sentimentality, and also income generation. Okay, they argued that the coming of the port meant the end of the lighters, the barges, those 15-foot barges. The lighter men went the way of the dodo. The new Bridgetown port transformed Bridgetown. It was now entered the realm of upgraded modern cities. We can say, without fear of contradiction, that the engineering work, all the millions of dollars poured into the exercise of absorbing Pelican Island between 1957 and 1961 has been worth it. And without it, we don't know what Barbados would